If I was to say mercy to you, how would you understand that? Sometimes grace and mercy kind of blend together, and people have a hard time distinguishing the two. This morning I want us to look at the mercy of God as demonstrated in the parable of the prodigal son. Is there anyone in this room this morning who has ever done something wrong and needed someone to be merciful to them? I know I have. Mercy is defined as compassionate treatment of an offender, an enemy, etc., giving them clemency, a disposition to be kind and forgiving when punishment is deserved and even warranted. One night in 1935, the story is told of Fiorello H. LaGuardia, then mayor of New York. He went to night court one time in the poorest part of his town. He dismissed the judge and took over the bench. The case that was before him involved an elderly lady who got caught stealing food to feed her grandchildren. He said, "I have to punish you, and that's a $10 fine or 10 days in jail." And as he spoke, he threw $10 in his hat, and then he proceeded to fine everyone in the courtroom 50 cents for living in a city where a person had to steal food to feed their grandchild. The hat was passed around, and the woman left the courtroom with her fine paid and $47.50 in her pocket. He had mercy on her. He showed her mercy. Long after the death of Calvin Coolidge, it is told that one night in the early days of his presidency that he was awoke early in the morning by a cat burglar going through his pockets. He asked the burglar not to take his watch or chain because it contained an engraved charm that he dearly wanted to keep. He engaged in a conversation with the burglar and discovered that the burglar was a student who couldn't afford to pay for his room or his bus fare back to college. So Coolidge counted out $32 out of his wallet, which he persuaded the stunned student to give him back when he could. He declared the money a loan and advised the young man to go out of the room the same way that he came in as to avoid the Secret Service. The student actually paid the loan back. That's quite a neat story. But again, you see this idea of showing mercy to someone. We need mercy, but we need mercy spiritually every bit as much as we need mercy physically. We need the spiritual mercy from God, because without that, we would surely die in our sins and suffer the full penalty of our sin. Jesus told the story of a Pharisee and a tax collector. The tax collector knew the only hope that he had was to throw himself before God at his mercy seat. He needed nothing except the mercy of God, and he was grateful and he begged for that mercy. The Pharisee didn't realize it, didn't realize his need for the mercy of God, and therefore struggled in his sin. Well, we can see that mercy demonstrated in the parable of the prodigal son. The father practices mercy with his sons, even though both of them deserve punishment for what they had done. And so he extends mercy to both of them, and that's what we want to look at. Thomas Bart Whitaker is 39 years old, and he's sitting on death row in Texas because he planned and executed the plan to murder his family. The problem was he did kill his mother and his brother, but he only wounded his father, not knowing that he had only wounded his father. And then he himself shot himself in his arm and tried to make it look like a robbery gone wrong. 6 months passed, and the police couldn't figure out what had gone on exactly. And Thomas Whitaker decided to move to Mexico. A year later, He was arrested in Mexico and extradited back to the United States and charged with the murders, and he was sentenced to death. The parole board met one last time for any requests for him, and his father requested mercy. He said, I've had enough of death. I don't want any more death. I want him to live. Now, I don't know if his father's kind of merciless in the sense that he wants him to live in that torment all the time of murder, but that he murdered his siblings. But he asked for mercy, and the board granted him it. And so now it's up to the governor of Texas to show clemency. You know, when it comes to family, we all want to show mercy. We all want to be merciful. But what about to our enemies? What about to the rest of the people? That's the question. You see, King David was challenged by God through the prophet Nathan to face his grievous sin that he had committed against Uriah, particularly the sins of adultery and murder, and then the subsequent sin of cover-up. In Psalm 51, David cries out to God and he says, "Have mercy on me, God. According to your steadfast love, according to your abundant mercy, blot out my transgressions, blot out my sin." Why do we always cry out when it's us against us for mercy for what we've committed? But we have such a challenge sometimes in showing other people mercy. You have to think about that. We are looking for compassion from others. God said in Exodus 33, when Moses asked him to show him his glory, he said, "I'll make all my goodness pass before you and will proclaim before you my name. I will be gracious to whom I will be gracious, and I will show mercy to whom I will show mercy." God is merciful. He is full of mercy, and he wants to extend that mercy to us. And if we cry out for that mercy and we have a repentant heart, we receive that mercy. David said he wanted the mercy of God according to the abundance of his mercy, his unending mercy. And during his earthly ministry, Jesus taught about mercy. He told the parable of the unmerciful servant who had been granted complete freedom from his debt. He was shown complete mercy for his debt. And he turned around, and that was a debt, by the way, that he couldn't repay. He had no chance of repaying that debt. And he turns around, and he doesn't show any mercy to his fellow servant underneath him who owes him a pittance compared to what he owed. See, the unmerciful servant didn't have any mercy in his heart for anyone other than himself. Even after the most gracious mercy ever extended to him, he couldn't find it within himself to be merciful to his fellow man. Jesus said that is nothing like the Father in heaven. The Father in heaven is the opposite of that. He is merciful, and he shows mercy to everyone. That alone should be an encouragement for all of us, just to be merciful to each other. So how does the parable of the prodigal son demonstrate that mercy? Mercy is a part of the Father's character. It is part of who he is. He doesn't have to stop and remind himself that he's merciful. He doesn't have to fight the idea or the temptation of wanting to get even with somebody. He doesn't have to fight any of that because he's merciful. It's part of his very being. The entire time that the prodigal son was off in the distant land, living it up sumptuously and with disregard for anything godly in his life, as he was chasing his desires and pleasures in this world, the Father is standing there at home. The Father is waiting for his return. He's watching for his return. He's waiting to see his son come to his senses and come back. He's waiting for a repentant heart to come back so that he could grant him mercy and restore him into fellowship. You see, mercy wasn't a struggle for the Father. because mercy was part of the relationship he had with his son. It was who he was. It was natural for him to show mercy and to be merciful, even though the situation didn't deserve it. God wants to be part of your life. He wants to be merciful to you. He's waiting for you to come back to him so he can show you mercy, so he can grant you mercy. You can see it in the compassion that he demonstrates when the son returns. He's still a long way off. And the father could have started by saying, "Oh, I can't wait for him to get here. I got the whip out. I got everything ready to punish this son." He could have done that, but he didn't. Instead, he runs and he embraces him. He gives him a kiss. He treated him with compassion and kindness. He didn't think about the sin that he committed. He thought about the heart that had turned back to him. He ran to him and they had that embrace. You know, I often think of that, and I can't help but think of my father when I talk about the father and the prodigal son. I wish sometimes, when I was younger, that my dad would show me mercy. And it wasn't because I had done something extremely bad or anything, but it was just that I couldn't move without making a mistake almost. And you think about it and you think, man, Dad, just give me a break. That's all I want is a break. But not with my papa. No, that wasn't the case. But with God, that is the case. He shows mercy to us, even when we deserve punishment and death. And he didn't just show that to the son, he lived it. That was part of his life. He goes out and he sees the young son, he embraces him and everything, he brings him in, and the first thing he does is say, we're going to have a celebration. Like Annabelle would say, we're going to have a humongous celebration. And they throw this big feast for him. And he brings him a robe and sandals and everything that says, you are part of the family. You are my son. You are welcome home. Now, I wonder what some of us would do if that was our children. You know, Diane's and my children, Brock and Dee Dee, you know them. And they did some things that were not so nice sometimes, like most children. And the tendency sometimes is to say, I'm going to show them. I'm going to teach them. And that's the way we want to go. And they do need to learn. We need to understand that. But when they come back and they're saying sorry, isn't the time to lay into them. It's the time to show them mercy. Because like James says in James chapter 2 and verse 13, he says, mercy triumphs over judgment. And it does every time. And that's why God warns us to be merciful to others. Because mercy does triumph over judgment. Now, what about the older son? How did God show mercy to the older son? He showed it to the younger son, and we get that. But he showed mercy to the older son as well. The Pharisees were a group of people who didn't really realize their need for God's mercy. In fact, they thought sometimes that God was lucky to have them. At least that's the way they acted. God was blessed to have them rather than them have God. And so they looked down their nose at people, at tax collectors and sinners. And so they didn't have a very merciful heart. In fact, they didn't have mercy in their heart. The older son in this parable didn't understand, he didn't realize that every day that he lived with the Father, he lived by the benefit of his mercy. Because none of us are perfect. And we all need the mercy of God extended to us. He had no idea that he needed the Father's mercy. all the time he was living with the Father. And when the younger son had wandered off and gone away, he thought, I'm the good guy. I don't need that. I know some Christians that think the same way, that are in that very same predicament. They don't think they need the mercy of God because they're good people. Well, you may be good, but being good in God's eyes is a different story. And all of us need the mercy of God. The older son demonstrated this in his actions when his younger brother returned from his wayward ways and repented, and the father had forgiven him. Instead of being happy that his brother, who spiritually was dead in his sin, and he returned and became spiritually alive again, instead of hugging his brother and welcoming him back, he wanted to punish him to the full extent of the law. I mean, he wanted the riot act read to him. He wanted him to be punished for all that he had done wrong, because he was a horrible sinner, not realizing all along that he was in the same boat as his younger brother. Have you ever been in that situation where you just want to see a person who's harmed you or harmed someone you love, maybe done worse than that you just want to see them punished, and you can't wait for them to be punished? You may not want that, because that may come back to get you. You see, we're supposed to have mercy in our hearts. We're supposed to be understanding of these things. The older son didn't understand any of it. I heard a fellow say one time to his sibling, I heard him, and it was in a public place. It was a horrible thing. But he just looked at him and he said, I hope you rot in hell. To his sibling. That's not mercy. But that's kind of where the older son was at. He didn't like that younger son at all. And then there was a celebration. How does a person celebrate the return of a sinner? How do we justify welcoming a sinner back into the family? I have heard many a Christian ready to pronounce judgment on someone else, but they sure appreciate mercy when they get it, but they're not willing to show mercy on their brothers and sisters. We ought to be merciful to each other, especially those of the household of faith. The father begged his older son to be merciful, to join the celebration, but he couldn't do it. You see, the father knew that if the older son didn't show mercy, that he wouldn't be shown mercy. He understood that. That's what Jesus says. And that's sad. There's a man, I read this story a little while ago, a man appeared before the judge one day in court for theft, and he was guilty of stealing, and he went before the court, and he pleaded for the mercy of the court, and the judge granted it to him. I don't know why. I don't know why he felt particularly merciful to this person, but 2 weeks later, that same man was in the courtroom again. This time, he had brought someone in and charged them with stealing from him. And the judge said, I recognize you. You were here about 2 weeks ago. He said, I granted you mercy. What happened? He said, why don't you show the same mercy to this fella? And he said, no, I want the full extent of the law put on him. And the judge looked at him and said, next time you're in my courtroom, that's what I'll give you. And he granted mercy to the fellow he was charging. You see, it's really easy when we want mercy. We have to have it. How can you not be merciful to me? But why should I be merciful to you? And isn't that how we think sometimes? That's not how the mercy of God works. I don't believe that anyone here this morning would argue the fact that God is merciful, that the mercy of God is beyond anything that most of us can even comprehend. It's unbelievable, the mercy that he shows us. He shows mercy to whom he chooses to show mercy, and he's shown mercy to all of us through the sacrifice of his son Jesus. But as merciful as God is, as great as his mercy is, he will be merciless to those who benefit from his mercy and do not pay that mercy forward to their fellow man. God expects us to be merciful to others as he is merciful to us. He expects us to pay it forward. And so this parable, if we look at the entire parable, not just the prodigal son, but the older son, the first thing that you notice is that we ought to be grateful and thankful for the mercy of God. We can call on him at any time for his mercy. And he extends his mercy to us. And we ought to treat it like the most precious blessing that we have in life, other than life itself in Christ Jesus. Because none of us would live spiritually if we didn't have the mercy of the Father in heaven. And the best way that we can possibly show our appreciation and gratitude for that mercy is to be merciful to others, especially those of the household of faith. Remember, Jesus said, "Blessed are the merciful, for they will receive mercy." You can turn that around and you can understand that it means those who are not merciful will not receive mercy. You can make that application. And that should be enough motivation for all of us to be merciful to each other. So starting this morning, let's consider that. Let's consider how we can be merciful to each other rather than putting judgment on people. If you haven't received the mercy of God this morning, if you haven't turned back to God, we encourage you to do that by coming forward and letting us know how we can help you while we stand and sing.
Years I spent in vanity and pride, caring not my Lord was crucified, knowing not it was for me he died on Calvary. Mercy there was great and grace was free, pardon there was multiplied to me. There my burdened soul found liberty at Calvary. By God's word at last my sin I learned. Then I trembled at the law I'd spurned, till my guilty soul imploring turned to Calvary. Mercy there was great and grace was free, pardon there was multiplied to me. There my burdened soul found liberty at Calvary. And now I give to Jesus everything. Now I gladly own him as my King. Now my raptured soul can only sing of Calvary. Mercy there was great and grace was free, pardon there was multiplied to me. It's there my burdened soul found liberty at Calvary. Oh, the love that drew salvation's plan. Oh, the grace that brought it down to man. Oh, the mighty gulf that God did span at Calvary. Mercy there was great and grace was free, pardon there was multiplied to me. There my burdened soul found liberty